Hello and welcome to the latest in my Theories of IR bite-sized series. Today we'll be taking a bite-sized look at liberalism in international relations. Liberalism as a political philosophy traces its origins back to the Enlightenment period of the kind of late 17th century through to the early 19th century. Liberalism today can mean different things to different people. It's actually a slightly vague term which has multiple slightly different meanings. But generally speaking, we can say that liberals stand for a certain set of core values. And these values include things like the idea of democracy and the desirability of democracy, an emphasis on human rights, and in particular the rights of the individual. Also an emphasis on free trade. Liberals do believe that free market capitalism is essentially good, and that through free trade and the free market, human prosperity will be increased. Liberals also believe in working towards a more peaceful world. That doesn't mean to say that liberals are pacifists per se, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. Liberals are not pacifists as such, but they do believe in progress towards a more peaceful world and finding ways to overcome the scourge of war. Ultimately, liberalism is an optimistic political philosophy which believes in human progress, that things can get better and will get better over time, that humanity is progressing towards a better and more enlightened world. And again, this is rooted in a belief, a kind of a view of human nature as being essentially good and essentially rational and reasoning and reasonable. Liberalism as a theory of IR builds upon these basic liberal values. So liberals in IR tend to focus on the potential for cooperation between states. So whereas realists are all about conflict and competition between states, liberals believe that it is not only desirable, but it is rational for states to find ways to cooperate with one another, and that states will see the rationality and the benefits of cooperation, particularly through creating international institutions like the United Nations, but many others also, and ultimately towards building a rules-based international order. Again, there is also an emphasis on free trade and the removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers and so on. And ultimately, liberalism in IR, once again, is a much more optimistic view of the world compared with realism, whereas realists are very much pessimistic of the idea of progress. Realists believe that the world always has been essentially about conflict and really always will be. It will always be about power politics and conflict according to a realist. Progress is not possible according to a realist. Liberals take a much more optimistic view and believe that even though conflict has been a big issue in the past and continues to be today to a significant extent, nonetheless we are moving towards a rules-based order and towards progress towards a more cooperative and ultimately more peaceful future. So, as mentioned, liberal philosophy has its roots in the Enlightenment period, and what we might call early liberal internationalism is associated particularly with a chap called Immanuel Kant, who was an 18th century liberal philosopher. And Kant was the first to use the phrase League of Nations to describe a proposed international organisation which would create a rules-based order between sovereign states. It was, of course, over 100 years after Kant's death before an actual League of Nations organisation came into being in 1919. The successor organisation today, of course, is the United Nations. The League of Nations was created in response to the carnage of the First World War and a widespread belief at the time, following the end of the war, that this must never be allowed to happen again, and that therefore a new approach to international order needed to be found in place of the old balance of power alliance-based systems which were seen as having contributed to the outbreak of war. So instead, kind of drawing on Kant's ideas, I guess, the idea of creating an international League of Nations was put into practice for the first time. Probably the most important 20th century architect of the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson, who at the time was the US President. Although Wilson championed the creation of the League of Nations, the United States never actually joined it, because although Wilson himself was very much in favour, Congress was not, and so the US never actually joined the organisation. But nonetheless, the US President Woodrow Wilson was instrumental in the creation of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, are implementations of the liberal idea of collective security. What do we mean by collective security? Well, realists, of course, believe that the best way to preserve the peace is through a balance of power, through defensive alliances. So a few states may make an alliance with like-minded states to kind of mutually defend one another against external attackers, and multiple centres of power or multiple alliance systems, rival alliances, may exist at the same time, and through creating a balance of power and through the deterrence effect, the peace will be preserved, according to realists. Liberals reject all of that. Liberals believe that balances of power are dangerous and ultimately lead to confrontation and mistrust and ultimately to conflict. And according to liberals, this is exactly what happened, for example, with the First World War, when the alliance system in Europe led to paranoia and confrontation on both sides and ultimately led to the outbreak of war in 1914. So liberals say do away with all of that. Rather than having competing alliance systems, instead the way forward is to have a single organisation, and ideally this organisation will have universal membership. Every state in the system will be a member of the organisation, the United Nations or whatever you want to call it. And the organisation, the UN type organisation, will have rules. And one of the most important rules is outlawing aggression. It essentially becomes illegal under international law for one state to commit an act of aggression against another state, for one state to invade or attack another state. That is outlawed. And so if a state breaks the rules under a collective security system, the rest of the states within the system, the international community, will all come together and collectively take action to stop the aggressor. This could be military action. It could also include things like sanctions and other means. It doesn't necessarily have to be military action, but military action being one of the options there. But the idea that basically the rules will be enforced by the international community. So if one state goes rogue and breaks the rules by attacking another state, for example, the rest of the international community will collectively take action to stop the aggressor. That's the basic idea of collective security. And it also includes measures like arms control treaties and so on, which are intended to, again, promote a more stable and more peaceful world as well. Both realists and liberals believe that states are rational actors, that they will make rational choices. However, they disagree on what the rational choice is. So to a realist, again, it's not rational to trust anyone. Under conditions of anarchy, you can't be sure that others are not going to attack you, or they're not going to serve their own interests, even if that means screwing you over. So you basically you have to assume that everyone is out to get you from a realist point of view, and therefore the only rational choice is to trust no one from a realist perspective. Liberals completely disagree with that. Liberals believe that although yes, there is anarchy in the sense that there is no world government, nonetheless we live in a world with a high degree of interdependence, particularly economic interdependence, and liberals believe that under those conditions of high interdependence, states and their governments will see the rationality of cooperation, and that they will choose to cooperate. So again, liberals are not they're not saying that states should cooperate for idealistic or altruistic reasons. They're saying that cooperation is simply the rational choice. States will cooperate because it is in their own interests to cooperate. So the idea is that trust can be built over time. Even if states don't trust each other initially, they can learn to trust one another. Past interactions inform future expectations, and trust can be built over time. And states, as rational actors, recognise that the long-term advantages of cooperation and building that cooperative relationship over time is more important than serving their immediate short-term interests. So states will act with an eye to the longer term, even if this means foregoing immediate advantage in the short term, according to liberals. This is well illustrated in the parable, the story of the stag hunt, which I'm not going to go into detail about now because there's a separate video on that. There's a 12-minute video talking about the stag hunt, which I would recommend looking at because it does really illustrate quite well the difference between liberalism and realism on this point. Once again, it's important to note that liberals are not pacifists. Liberals do believe in working towards a more peaceful world. They're very much in favour of that, and they believe it is possible to make progress towards a more peaceful world through a rules-based order. However, liberals also believe that sometimes, and again looking back at the principle of collective security, sometimes it is necessary for the international community to take action in order to uphold the rules, even if that may mean sometimes military intervention. So there are times, there are circumstances when liberals would actually would advocate intervention, including military intervention, for the purposes of upholding the international rules-based order. So liberals are not pacifists. However, they do believe that war should only be a last resort in a just cause in order to uphold the rules of the international system, to protect human rights and so on. Just a couple of further concepts. So the first is democratic peace theory. This refers to the liberal belief that democracies will not usually fight one another, that democracies don't usually go to war with other democracies. And there is some empirical evidence to support this idea. So liberals believe that the the spread of democratic systems of government is desirable in its own right, but also that this will ensure greater peace and stability in the international system. So that's the idea of democratic peace theory. Commercial peace theory refers to the liberal belief that cooperative trade relationships will lead on to political cooperation. So because of interdependence, because states recognise the rationality of cooperation, they will build cooperative economic relationships, but through that they will develop trust, they will learn to work together, and that this will lead to political cooperation as well. Through free market capitalism, through the development of economic cooperation, this will lead on to political cooperation and to a more peaceful world system. So that's the idea of commercial peace theory. And again, if you'd like more information on these two concepts, see my longer lecture style video on liberalism. So, to summarise, liberalism represents a much more optimistic view of global politics compared with realism. Of course, realists would say that they are not being pessimistic, they are being realistic. That's why they call themselves realists. But realists believe that ultimately we will never get away from the reality of power politics and the consequent conflict in the world system. Liberals reject that. Liberals believe that it is possible to make progress towards a more peaceful, rules-based international order, and that progress is not only possible, that it is happening, that we see evidence of a gradual progression away from the world of the past, the world of power politics and realpolitik and imperialism and conflict and so on, moving away from that towards a world of rules-based international order and norms and human rights and international institutions and so on. So a much more optimistic view of the world system and a belief in progress. Liberals believe that cooperation is the rational choice and that states as rational actors will be able to see the rationality of cooperation. So states cooperate not necessarily for altruistic or moral reasons, not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but rather because they can see that it is in their own interests to cooperate, that everyone benefits from cooperation. So states as rational actors are able to see the rationality of cooperation, according to liberals. Liberals believe that ultimately the rules-based approach is the best way to preserve the peace. So the idea of collective security through organisations like the UN. Liberals, however, are not pacifists. Liberals do believe that intervention, including military action, may sometimes be necessary in order to uphold the rules-based order, but that such action should be a last resort and should only be taken with the approval of the international community through the proper channels, the proper mechanisms, such as the United Nations Security Council. We've mentioned the idea of democratic peace theory and commercial peace theory, and linked to that the idea of free trade and economic interdependence, leading to both increased prosperity and political cooperation. So liberals believe that free market capitalism is essentially good, that free trade and free market capitalism will ultimately lead to economic growth, and that this will increase prosperity for everyone and generate the wealth to create a better society at the global level, and that this will also, again, economic interdependence will lead to political cooperation as well. So liberals very positive about capitalism and the free market. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of the liberal paradigm on international relations, and if you'd like more information, then once again please check out my longer lecture style video on liberalism. The next in the bite-size series will look at neo-Marxist perspectives, and particularly dependency and world systems theory. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you on the next video. Thanks very much.